Something happened in the darkness over Caracas that changed the rules of international power forever. Right now, as you're watching this, Nicolas Maduro sits in a Manhattan federal courthouse, shackled and defiant, claiming he's a prisoner of war. But the real story isn't about one man's capture. It's about what happens when the world's most powerful military decides that sovereignty, international law, and diplomatic norms are merely suggestions. And what happened on January 3rd, 2026, at 2 a.m. local time, could determine whether we're entering an era where military force becomes the primary tool of American foreign policy, or whether this audacious operation will stand as a cautionary tale about the limits of raw power. Western intelligence agencies are still piecing together the full implications. The question keeping strategic analysts awake at night is simple but terrifying. If the United States can extract a sitting president from his own capital city in the middle of the night, who's next? And more importantly, what does this mean for every other nation that finds itself on Washington's list? I'm Sophie Hart, and you're watching Sophie Hart Reports. If you want to understand the seismic shift that just occurred in how nations exert power over one another, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is unfolding in real time. What began as a counter-narcotics operation has evolved into something far more dangerous, and the aftershocks are rippling across Latin America, Europe, and beyond. Let me take you back to the planning stages. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in anger. This was months of meticulous preparation, intelligence gathering, and military rehearsal for what would become the most controversial military action of Donald Trump's second presidency. In August 2025, something shifted in U.S.-Venezuela policy. While most of the world focused on the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and tensions with China, a small CIA unit quietly infiltrated Venezuela. Their mission, codenamed Operation Absolute Resolve, was to provide what intelligence officials called extraordinary insight into Nicolas Maduro's every movement. They knew where he slept, what he ate, where he traveled. They even knew about his pets. But the CIA wasn't working alone. At the same time, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the American fleet, the USS Gerald R. Ford, swept into the Caribbean. Warships began appearing off Venezuela's coast. Fighter jets conducted what the Pentagon called counter-narcotics patrols, striking dozens of alleged drug boats and blocking sanctioned oil tankers. The military buildup was unmistakable. The message was clear: surrender or face extraction. At an undisclosed military facility somewhere in the United States, Delta Force operators were training against a full-scale replica of Maduro's compound. The mock-up was built using intelligence gathered from CIA assets on the ground, satellite imagery, and intercepted communications. Every door, every wall, every potential escape route had been mapped. The operators rehearsed the mission dozens of times, perfecting their approach until they could execute it in complete darkness in under 30 minutes. Trump gave Maduro one final chance. In a private phone call 1 week before the operation, the U.S. president delivered an ultimatum: you got to surrender. According to Trump, Maduro came close to accepting, but in the end, he stayed put in his heavily guarded compound. That decision sealed his fate. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, January 2nd, 2026, President Trump gave the final order. Operation Absolute Resolve was greenlit. What happened next was a display of American military power that few nations could hope to match. At approximately 2 a.m. local time on January 3rd, explosions rocked Caracas. The strikes weren't random. U.S. forces systematically targeted Venezuela's air defense network, 53 long and medium-range systems, dozens of short-range missile batteries, over 440 anti-aircraft cannons. Within minutes, Venezuela's ability to defend its airspace was obliterated. Simultaneously, American cyber warfare units paralyzed Venezuela's ground forces. The Venezuelan military numbered 93,000 troops, but in the critical 2.5 hours of the operation, they might as well have not existed. Communications were jammed. Command and control centers went dark. The 93,000-man army was rendered helpless as American helicopters penetrated Venezuelan airspace unopposed. At Fuerte Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex where Maduro and his wife were hiding in their personal residence, the assault began. Combat helicopters unleashed rockets and missiles at precise targets. According to Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, most of Maduro's personal guard were killed in the initial assault. The building's steel doors, designed to withstand anything short of a direct missile strike, were breached by American special forces in less than 10 minutes. The operators moved with surgical precision. Through smoke and chaos, they located Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. Within 30 minutes of boots on the ground, both were in American custody. 2.5 hours after the first explosion, they were airborne, being transported out of Venezuela aboard American military aircraft. The death toll remains disputed. An anonymous Venezuelan official initially reported at least 40 casualties, including civilians and military personnel. That number was updated to 80 on January 4th. The Trump administration has released no official casualty figures. By dawn on January 3rd, Nicolas Maduro was no longer in Venezuela. He was being flown to New York City to face federal narcoterrorism charges in Manhattan Federal Court. The world woke up to images that seemed impossible. A sitting president, forcibly removed from his own country by a foreign military power. Video footage showed Maduro being perp-walked down a hallway marked DEANYD, flanked by agents in DEA jackets. The symbolism was deliberate. This was justice, American style, delivered at the end of a helicopter gunship. Caribbean airspace was immediately shut down. Hundreds of flights were cancelled or delayed as the region went into lockdown. The closure lasted until midnight Eastern Time on January 3rd, when U.S. Transport Secretary Sean Duffy announced that restrictions would be lifted. But the message had been delivered. When America decides to act, entire regions must adapt or suffer the consequences. In Venezuela itself, a tense calm descended. Caracas was unnaturally quiet on January 4th. Convenience stores, gas stations, and businesses remained closed. Roads typically filled with morning commuters sat empty. The presidential palace was guarded by a mix of armed civilians and military personnel, but no one seemed certain who was actually in charge. Venezuela's Supreme Court quickly moved to fill the power vacuum, ordering Vice President Delcy Rodriguez to assume the powers and duties of acting president. But Trump made clear he had no intention of working with the Venezuelan opposition, the group that much of the international community had recognized as the legitimate government. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, barely rated a mention in Trump's post-operation press conference. Instead, Trump said he would run Venezuela through Rodriguez and the existing government structure until a transition could be arranged. The constitutional and legal questions are staggering. In his first court appearance on January 5th, Maduro was defiant. "I am the president of Venezuela. I consider myself a prisoner of war. I was captured at my home in Caracas." He and his wife pleaded not guilty to multiple drug trafficking charges. U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein ordered Maduro held without bail until at least a March 17th hearing. The international response split along predictable lines, but with an intensity that surprised even seasoned diplomats. China issued one of its sharpest condemnations of U.S. foreign policy in years. The Chinese Foreign Ministry demanded that the United States immediately release Maduro and his wife, calling the operation a clear violation of international law, and warning that such action set a dangerous precedent for international relations. Cuba, Venezuela's closest ally, held a ceremony on January 15th to honor 32 Cuban soldiers killed in the U.S. intervention. President Miguel Díaz-Canel appeared alongside 94-year-old former leader Raúl Castro, labeling the American action as state terrorism. The symbolism was powerful. The old guard of Latin American resistance standing together against what they characterized as American imperialism. But the most explosive reaction came from Colombia. President Gustavo Petro, a former guerrilla fighter, warned that he would take up arms for his country if necessary, following Trump's thinly veiled threats that a similar operation there sounds good to me. On January 8th, thousands of Colombians took to the streets in Cúcuta and other cities near the Venezuelan border. On January 10th, Nestor Gregorio Vera, head of the largest FARC dissidents group, called for guerrilla organizations to unite against any potential U.S. intervention. The fear is palpable across Latin America. If the United States can execute a military operation of this magnitude against Venezuela with apparent impunity, what's to stop similar actions against Colombia, Nicaragua, or any other government Washington decides is illegitimate? Even within the United States, the operation sparked fierce debate. A Reuters Ipsos poll conducted January 4th to 5th found Americans evenly split: 33% approved, 34% disapproved, and 33% were unsure. The partisan divide was stark, with 65% of Republicans supporting the intervention, but only 11% of Democrats approving. Democratic Senator Mark Warner, vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, raised perhaps the most fundamental question: does this mean any large country can indict the ruler of a smaller, adjacent country and take that person out? It's a question that legal scholars, military strategists, and diplomats are still grappling with. International law experts are nearly unanimous in their assessment. Operation Absolute Resolve violated fundamental principles of sovereignty and the UN Charter. The Chatham House analysis was blunt. The capture of a sitting president by foreign special forces, accompanied by strikes on military targets, represents a significant violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. The Trump administration's legal justification rests on shaky ground. They argue the president has inherent constitutional authority to conduct law enforcement actions with military support, especially when dealing with narco-terrorism that threatens American lives. They compare the devastating effects of illegal drug imports to an armed attack on the United States, attempting to frame the operation as self-defense. But in international law, self-defense requires a kinetic assault with military means. Drug trafficking, no matter how destructive, doesn't meet that threshold. The administration also avoided citing pro-democratic intervention as a formal justification, perhaps aware that such claims would ring hollow given Trump's decision to work with Venezuela's existing government rather than the democratic opposition. For Maduro personally, the legal situation is equally grim. U.S. courts consistently apply the Kerr-Frisbee doctrine, which holds that American jurisdiction applies regardless of how a defendant was brought to trial. Even if Maduro was kidnapped in violation of international law, American courts will still proceed with prosecution. The precedent was set with Manuel Noriega in 1989, and nothing suggests the courts will deviate now. Military analysts universally agree on one point. Operation Absolute Resolve was brilliantly executed from a tactical standpoint. The precision, the speed, the overwhelming application of force, the intelligence gathering, the operational security, every aspect of the military operation demonstrated American capabilities at their peak. But tactically brilliant and strategically sound are not the same thing. The Center for Strategic and International Studies assessment was damning. This was a raid, meaning all U.S. forces withdrew afterward. Maduro's officials remain in charge of Venezuela. The Trump administration proposes to work through these officials, not through the opposition. This approach will likely fail, requiring additional air and missile strikes in the future. The power vacuum is already becoming apparent. With Maduro gone, but his government structure intact, Venezuela faces increased potential for corruption, drug trafficking, and large-scale migration. The very problems the operation was supposed to solve could actually worsen. Unlike the 1989 Panama invasion, where U.S. troops were given constabulary responsibilities to ensure stability after Manuel Noriega's capture, no such planning appears to have occurred here. Congress was not notified until after Maduro was in custody, a break from precedent that further eroded legislative oversight of military operations. The Trump administration had been publicly hinting at military action against Venezuela for months. They had ample opportunity to seek congressional authorization, particularly from a Republican-controlled Congress. The decision to bypass this process has long-term implications for the balance of power in American government. Perhaps the most concerning development is what the operation has done to Trump's calculus about the use of military force. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, Trump is thrilled with the outcome. He believes the operation reignited his political momentum and demonstrated that there are no concrete limits on his ability to wield power. In the days following Maduro's capture, Trump has renewed threats against Colombia, criticized Mexico's leadership, predicted Cuba's government would fall, and repeatedly demanded that Denmark sell Greenland to the United States. Senator Lindsey Graham summarized the new approach. "We need to clear up our backyard. The theme here is securing the border is really important. We need to get to the source of the problem." The concern among foreign policy experts is that Operation Absolute Resolve has become a template. A successful military intervention, executed without congressional authorization, facing minimal domestic political backlash and achieving its immediate objective. Every autocratic leader in Latin America and beyond must now wonder if they're next on the list. As of February 10, 2026, 1 month after the raid, Venezuela remains trapped between uncertainty and expectation. The government claims to have released more than 800 political prisoners, though details remain scarce. The U.S. Embassy in Caracas has reopened, not for visa services, but for intelligence operations and economic controls. The Venezuelan military has symbolically pledged subordination to acting President Delcy Rodriguez. But substantive change has been slow. People are becoming impatient. The question looming over everything is whether this coercive model will actually work or whether delays and resistance will prevent meaningful reform. With Maduro facing trial in New York, his supporters have organized rallies demanding his release. The political opposition, sidelined by Trump's decision to work with Maduro's government, grows increasingly frustrated. The economic situation remains dire. Oil production, which Trump hoped would revive quickly, has shown minimal improvement. Stability is a prerequisite for economic recovery, and stability remains elusive. Infrastructure damage from the January 3rd strikes is still being assessed. Families in La Guaira state are still cleaning debris from buildings hit during the operation. The Venezuela operation sits at an inflection point in how nations exert power in the 21st century. For decades, the international system operated on principles established after World War II: sovereign equality of states, non-interference in internal affairs, peaceful resolution of disputes. Operation Absolute Resolve demonstrates that when a sufficiently powerful nation decides these principles no longer serve its interests, they can be discarded with minimal consequence. The precedent is dangerous not just for what it says about American power, but for what it implies about how other powerful nations might act. If the United States can justify extracting a foreign leader under the banner of counter-narcotics, what's to prevent China from conducting similar operations against leaders it claims are harboring separatists? What's to prevent Russia from justifying interventions based on protecting Russian-speaking populations? The erosion of international norms is gradual until it isn't. Each violation makes the next one easier to justify. Each successful operation emboldens the next attempt. What happened in Caracas on January 3, 2026, might be remembered as the moment when raw military power decisively overtook international law as the primary organizing principle of global affairs. As we move deeper into February 2026, several critical questions remain unanswered. Will Venezuela stabilize under acting President Rodriguez, or will the country descend into further chaos? Will Congress reassert its constitutional authority over military operations, or will the executive branch continue to act unilaterally? Will Trump follow through on his threats against Colombia, Cuba, and other nations, or was Venezuela a one-time operation? Most importantly, how will other nations respond? Will they accept this new reality where military force trumps sovereignty, or will they band together to establish new norms and deterrents? The coming months will be crucial in determining whether Operation Absolute Resolve was an aberration or a preview of America's foreign policy approach for years to come. One thing is certain: the world after January 3, 2026 is fundamentally different from the world before. The rules have changed. The question now is whether any new rules will take their place, or whether we're entering an era where power alone determines what's possible. The aftershocks from that night in Caracas are still spreading, and we won't know their full impact for months, maybe years to come. But one fact is undeniable. When Delta Force operators breached those steel doors at Fuerte Tiuna, they didn't just capture one man, they shattered assumptions about sovereignty, law, and the limits of American power that had held for nearly 8 decades. What comes next could define international relations for a generation, and right now, nobody knows the answer.